Hi, this is Professor Scott Sampson again, and we're going to do a little review of articles for the final exam. So, as a reminder, this is not a substitute for reviewing the articles in your class notes. This is a great resource if you want to use it, but not essential because you have the articles themselves in your class notes. So, if we look at our syllabus, there was an Appendix B, and it was study questions for the article readings. There's a green line here. This green line represents the break between the midterm and things after the midterm. The things at the top were on the midterm exam. The things throughout are on the final. So the final is, in fact, cumulative. And we will have more coverage of the things after the midterm on the final, these 4 articles. And if you want a review of the things from before the midterm, there's another video about that, and hopefully if I can get this figured out, I will put the link to that other video in the footnote of this here to review those other articles. Alright, so the articles since the midterm, we had 4 of them. We had the Paris-Sermon Zytham-Mulberry article on the gap model, the Hart-Heskett-Sasser article on service recovery, the Hart article on unconditional service guarantees, and the Reichelt article on Net Promoter Score. So, we'll start with this Paris-Sermon article, this gap model. So one of the questions was, how does service quality compare with goods quality? And you may remember this. This was in our class discussion. We talked about search properties, experience properties, and credence properties. And that this proposition is that consumers typically rely on experience properties when evaluating service quality, that services tend to be more experiential in nature, whereas in terms of the assessment of quality process, and that the search properties, a lot of times the physical goods tend to be more dominant in search properties. You also need to know what these credence properties are. Now don't get that confused with the Clearwater Revival. It's a different credence there. But these are things, properties that were discussed in the article that you can evaluate even after you experience them because they require some type of expert judgment. So an example that I gave in class was universities, is how do you know how good of education you're getting? You know, it's kind of hard to tell. You think it's a good education. It sounds like a good education. We really rely on expert judgment. In some cases, I don't know how expert this is, but things like, U.S. News and World Report rankings or other rankings and things like that. So. All right, so we also had questions in this article about the gaps. What are the gaps? How do they relate to one another? How are they managed? Internal and external elements of service quality. So that's really in the gap model. This last point here is you do not need to know the 10 determinants of service quality. Just know that they exist and how they kind of come into play. But you don't have to memorize those 10 things. Some students get concerned about that. All right, so here's the gap model. And as you'll recall, we have expectations come from word-of-mouth communication, personal needs, past experience, and external communication. So customers form their expectations, and then they have their perceptions of service, and that gap 5 is really the quality gap there. And that gap 5 is really a function of the other 4 gaps. So we have gap 1, which is management perceptions. It's really, does management understand what customers might expect? Gap 2, if they do understand, maybe gap 2 is they don't translate that into the quality specifications. That's the design gap, gap 2. Gap 3 is the delivery. So maybe we design it appropriately, but maybe the employees are not executing on the design. So that would be gap 3. Or maybe the employees are executing well, but we're communicating improper expectations, unrealistic expectations, or so forth, to our customers, which is gap 4. So again, it's this idea is that we have these different gaps, and that any of these gaps, 1 through 4, can lead to gap 5, which is the quality gap. All right, so that's the gap model. Also represented in this diagram at the bottom, we have the provider's domain, so that's kind of internal in the organization. And then the customer's process domain is external, so that's this relationship here, is that we have things that we do internally, such as management coming to understand customer perceptions, design, delivery, things that then lead to, in the customer's process domain, it leads to their perceptions of quality. Now, in the article, they didn't call it customer process domain, provider process domain. They called it, the marketer and things like that. But that was a little bit kind of confusing language that they were using there. So I think this is probably more simple and will be clearer. All right, so that's the gap model article. The next article we covered was the profitable art of service recovery. So why is prompt service recovery important? What are its limitations? And then the elements of an effective service recovery system. So remember there was this discussion we had, it was a little exercise we did in class. They talked about some statistics about like the average business never hears from 96% of its unhappy customers. Complainers are more likely than non-complainers to do business again with the company that upset them. Other things like customers who register a complaint, 54 to 70% do business again. But in particular, this idea is that if a complaint is resolved quickly, there's really like a 95% chance that the customer is going to come back, according to this TARP study. The average customer who has a problem with an organization tells 9 or 10, so there's kind of a multiplying effect. Customers have complained and have it resolved, they tell about 5 people. Again, this is from the TARP study, which was some of this was cited in the article and others I presented in class, but it's just to have an understanding of the dynamics of service failure and of service recovery. So, as we talked about this, what's most important was kind of the bottom line point. Now I'm going to put this up here. Please don't share this with future students because it will bias them as we have this discussion here and kind of take away some of the thought process that's essential in this. But remember this, we talked about the cost of service quality. This was kind of the answer to this, is that we have unresolved complaints and we have resolved promptly. And the things above this red box here were things that if you can resolve a complaint, if you have an unresolved complaint, I mean, what happens is that the customer has a bad impression and they'll tell 9 or 10 people, so you have 9 or 10 additional bad impressions with that. But then additionally, if we have a complaint, we recognize that only about 4% of customers that have a problem actually complain to the organization about it. So that other 96% represents like 25 other customers that complain with their feet, which isn't exactly 96%. The math is slightly off, but for the purposes we need, it's good enough. And then they will tell 9 others, so themselves plus the 9 others is the 10, for a negative 250 negative impressions of customers that didn't complain but had problems and the people that they told. So the overall impact of that one recorded complaint really represents, that's the tip of the iceberg, it represents that negative 260 impressions upon customers. But if we resolve them promptly, sure, we can solve it for that customer. We record the complaint was recorded, we fix it promptly, they come back, they tell 5 people, so you have 6 impressions. But the problem is the stuff again in the red box continues, is it's the things that we don't hear about. And that's really what the big problem with doing service recovery. Service recovery is good, but it doesn't work in isolation because we have to also improve the process, especially for the sake of those who don't register their complaints that we can't recover from. Okay, elements of a service recovery system. There was a whole bunch of these listed in the article. Measure the cost, break the silence, anticipate needs, act fast, train employees, power the front line, close the loop. Okay, these are all pretty straightforward, and the article has really great, very concise descriptions of each of those. So be sure you review these elements of an effective service recovery system. All right, the next article was the power of unconditional service guarantees. So the benefits and elements of a guarantee and what type of firms were candidates. So that was kind of in that appendix study guide in the syllabus. So, benefits. Why do they work? We talked about this. This is from the article, but review this. Why do they work? A key thing with this that we talked about in class was that most of these are about operational improvement. In fact, the first 4 are really about operational improvement. And number 5 is the only one really about external to the firm. It's, building the marketing muscle and so forth. So anyway, I want you to think about this in terms of why we do an unconditional service guarantee. So what are the characteristics of an unconditional service guarantee? Okay, there's 5 of them. Unconditional, easy to understand and communicate, meaningful, easy and painless to invoke, easy and quick to collect on. So having, again, a general understanding of what these are. Again, the article is pretty straightforward about that. All right, who are unconditional service guarantees for? This was kind of at the end or tail end of our discussion about this. Is not for companies that are struggling to satisfy customers that want to boost quality. It'll probably just cause the problem to be worse. Not for average companies that just want some marketing hype. It's probably not worth it, largely because of that 96% that don't complain. It's really for companies, and I should change the language here, but it's spitting distance, but it's companies that are really good companies that want to be great. And an unconditional service guarantee can provide that motivation. It's about achieving operational excellence, which is kind of the bottom line on that. Alrighty, so that's the service guarantee article. Finally, we had the article on the Net Promoter Score, where Reichelt taught about what is loyalty. We talked about how does it relate to growth, customer retention rates, and other measures. What is the Net Promoter Score? How is it measured and interpreted? What are the benefits of using Net Promoter Scores? What are some of the limits? Okay, so a little summary of that. Loyalty was discussed. We talked about this idea of willingness to sacrifice. And if we're willing to sacrifice, that implies that we have more affection for the organization and more appreciation for the organization and likely to be more loyal. So that this idea of sacrifice is what Reichelt kind of leveraged into the idea of, are you willing to put your reputation on the line? Are you willing to make an interpersonal sacrifice and talk to others about your experience with a particular service provider? How is it calculated? You definitely want to know this. So there's the Net Promoter question there. There's the detractor range, passively satisfied promoters, the score being promoters, percent promoters minus percent detractors, which is mathematically equivalent to saying the number of promoters minus the number of detractors divided by the total number of responses, including everybody. So anyway, so you need to understand that. Pretty straightforward. Why is it effective? Why does it work? It has a high response rate. It's so simple, easy to understand. It also gives real-time feedback. So versus other feedback mechanisms that we talked about in Chapter 12, is that it's super easy to understand, and you can collect it on an ongoing basis and get really real-time feedback. You can use it to compare. Across organizations, across different departments, so forth, different customer segments, and so forth. So because it's simple, it's kind of standardized, it's easy to compare. And then this idea about what some limitations are, the article talked about how loyalty predicts growth, which, I think it does to some degree. It measures loyalty. It's simple. It measures, really, I talked about in class, the pulse of the customer. What is the pulse, meaning how is our relationship with the customer? It does not measure things like how can we improve. It does not measure things like, which of our employees, are exceptional. I guess it kind of does, because you can measure loyalty about that and tie it to employees, but it's not tied specifically to employees. It's talking about recommending, although I guess you could say how likely would you recommend this employee, but that would be kind of strange. Anyway, so it doesn't measure other things that we talked about in Chapter 12. You recall in Chapter 12 there was a whole array of goals. And actually there's a couple of them that it does kind of fit in, the Net Promoter Score. The Net Promoter Score is about assessing loyalty, which you can use to benchmark versus the competition or compare across the organizations, which we talked about. But most of these other things need other measures. So the point of that is, even if you use Net Promoter Score, it's probably a good idea to kind of couple that with some other measurements that would help you accomplish other goals besides that. But if all you're looking for is to measure loyalty, Net Promoter Score is really a common way to do that. Well, that's the 4 articles. I can maybe make a couple of comments about the chapters from the book on the final exam, even though I'm not going to kind of go through those because they're pretty straightforward. If you saw the midterm review, you know that these chapter articles are pretty concise and direct. Before the midterm, on the final, if you do, it depends on which version of the final, but there might be a few questions about each of those. Nothing on Chapter 1, but 2 through 6. Okay, and I have included 6 here, which I didn't include on the midterm, at least on the video, as you see that. And then after the midterm, 6 to 8, although I think I have one I have 9 questions on. That's Chapter 7, 8, 9. We skipped 10, 11, 12, and then Chapter 16. So those you need to know more about, the ones that are since the midterm. So anyway, for that, I encourage you to review the chapters, review your class notes. Again, pretty straightforward. If you stayed up on things, we talked about that at the beginning of this semester, is if you can stay up on things, prepare for class, take notes, occasionally review your notes, you will be okay. The final should be fine for you. And then it will be on to victory. So, hang in there, final exam, endure to the end, and it's going to be great. And we will see you at the final exam.